The humid air of the South Carolina plantation hung thick with the scent of tobacco and human suffering in the summer of 1799. Magnolia Grove plantation stretched across hundreds of acres, its white-columned mansions standing like a monument to wealth built on broken backs and shattered dreams. Among the weathered slave quarters, where hope went to die, lived a woman whose very presence would soon challenge the natural order of this cruel world. Eliza Moore was not like the other slaves. Where others were lean from meager rations and backbreaking labor, Eliza's body defied the plantation's attempts to diminish her. Her frame was large, imposing, carrying weight that seemed impossible given the circumstances of her bondage. At 32 years old, she moved with a deliberate grace that unnerved those who expected submission from someone of her station. The other slaves whispered about her in the darkness of their quarters. Some said she hoarded food, stealing scraps to maintain her size. Others claimed she possessed knowledge passed down from her grandmother, a woman who had arrived on the slave ships with secrets from the old country still burning in her eyes. But Eliza never explained herself, never justified her existence to anyone. Master Jonathan Whitmore owned Magnolia Grove, but it was his overseer, Thomas Caldwell, who ruled the daily lives of the enslaved. Caldwell was a man of average height, but outsized cruelty, his weathered face bearing the permanent scowl of someone who found pleasure in the suffering of others. He carried a leather whip that had tasted the blood of countless backs, and his voice could freeze the summer air with its venom. From the moment Caldwell first laid eyes on Eliza, something dark stirred within him. Her size offended him in ways he couldn't articulate. In the world where he controlled every aspect of the slaves' lives, their food, their rest, their very breath, Eliza's body seemed to mock his authority. How dare she appear well-fed when he decided who ate and who went hungry? "Look at this one," Caldwell sneered to his assistant Marcus Webb as they watched Eliza working in the tobacco fields. "Fat as a prize pig while the others waste away. She's stealing food, mark my words." Webb, a younger man with nervous eyes, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe she just carries weight different, sir." Caldwell's hand moved to his whip. "Different? Boy, there ain't nothing different about these people except what we allow to be different. And I don't allow this." The sun beat down mercilessly as Eliza bent to tend the tobacco plants, her movements steady and methodical. She could feel Caldwell's eyes on her, burning with a hatred that went beyond the casual cruelty he showed the others. This was personal, and she knew it would only get worse. That evening, as the slaves returned to their quarters, Caldwell made his move. "You there, Eliza!" His voice cracked like thunder across the dusty yard. "Front and center, now!" Eliza straightened slowly, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching. The other slaves scattered like leaves in a storm, knowing better than to be caught in the crossfire of Caldwell's rage. "You've been stealing food," Caldwell accused, circling her like a predator. "Look at you, fat as a house while good Christian folk go without. Where you hiding it?" "I ain't stolen nothing, sir," Eliza replied, her voice steady and low. There was something in her tone that made Caldwell's skin crawl, a confidence that had no place in a slave's mouth. "Don't you lie to me, girl!" Caldwell raised his whip, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way Eliza stood her ground, or the strange calm in her eyes, but for a moment he hesitated. "Search her quarters," he barked to Webb. "Turn everything upside down. Find where she's hiding the food." Webb reluctantly entered Eliza's small cabin, emerging minutes later empty-handed. "Nothing, sir. Just her things." Caldwell's face reddened with frustration. "Then she's eating it all before she gets back. From now on, you get half rations, Eliza. Maybe that'll teach you some humility." As Caldwell stalked away, Eliza remained standing in the yard, her eyes following his retreating figure. The other slaves began to emerge from their hiding places, but none dared approach her. There was something different about Eliza now, something that made the evening air feel charged with electricity. That night, As the plantation settled into uneasy sleep, Eliza sat in her cabin by the light of a single candle. From beneath her thin mattress, she withdrew a small cloth bundle. Inside were items that would have meant death if discovered: dried herbs, small bones, and a piece of iron shaped into a crude symbol. These were gifts from her grandmother, along with knowledge that had survived the Middle Passage and the auction block. Eliza's grandmother had whispered to her in the old language, teaching her that power came not from the whip or the chain, but from understanding the fears that lived in every human heart. The mind, her grandmother had said, is the only thing they cannot truly own, and a mind that knows the old ways can turn their strength into weakness. As Eliza began to arrange the items in a pattern on her cabin floor, she whispered words in a language that predated the plantation, predated the ships, predated the very concept of her bondage. The candle flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move with a life of their own. Outside, a nightbird called out, its cry echoing across the tobacco fields. In the overseer's house, Thomas Caldwell stirred in his sleep, his dreams suddenly filled with the image of dark eyes that held no fear, only a patience that stretched back through generations of suffering and survival. The war between Eliza Moore and Thomas Caldwell had begun, though only one of them knew it yet. 3 weeks had passed since Caldwell reduced Eliza's rations, yet her appearance remained unchanged. If anything, she seemed to carry herself with even greater dignity, her presence in the fields becoming more pronounced rather than diminished. This impossibility gnawed at Caldwell like a festering wound, consuming his thoughts during the day and haunting his sleep at night. The overseer had taken to watching Eliza obsessively, convinced that she was somehow circumventing his punishment. He would appear suddenly at her workstation, searching for hidden food or evidence of theft. He questioned other slaves about her activities, threatening them with the whip if they lied to protect her, but no one had seen anything, and Eliza continued her work with the same steady rhythm that had always marked her days. "It ain't natural," Caldwell muttered to Webb as they stood on the porch of the overseer's house, watching the slaves work in the distance. "A woman her size don't maintain on half rations. She's getting food somewhere." Webb wiped sweat from his brow, uncomfortable with his superior's growing fixation. "Maybe she's just built different, sir. Some folks carry weight no matter what they eat." "Built different?" Caldwell's voice rose dangerously. "Boy, you starting to sound like you sympathize with that creature. You best remember which side of the whip you're on." That afternoon, Caldwell decided to escalate his campaign against Eliza. He assigned her to the most grueling tasks, hauling water barrels from the well to the fields, loading tobacco bales onto wagons, and cleaning the stables in the suffocating heat. Work that would have broken a smaller person seemed to barely affect her. She completed each task with the same methodical precision, never complaining, never showing signs of the exhaustion that should have overwhelmed her. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Caldwell made a decision that would prove to be his first step toward madness. He would stay awake that night and watch Eliza's cabin, determined to catch her in whatever deception she was practicing. Hidden behind a cluster of oak trees near the slave quarters, Caldwell settled in for his vigil. The night was unusually quiet, with even the ever-present chorus of crickets seeming muted. A thin crescent moon provided little light, casting the plantation in deep shadows that seemed to shift and move with every breath of wind. Around midnight, Caldwell saw a faint light appear in Eliza's cabin window. Not the steady glow of a candle, but something that flickered and danced like fireflies trapped in glass. He crept closer, his heart pounding with anticipation of finally catching her in the act of something. As he approached the cabin, he began to hear sounds that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the rustle of hidden food being consumed, but something far more disturbing. A low humming filled the air, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost musical, yet unlike any melody he had ever heard. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet and into his bones. Caldwell pressed himself against the cabin wall, trying to peer through a gap in the wooden planks. What he saw inside defied explanation. Eliza sat in the center of the small room, surrounded by objects he couldn't identify in the strange, dancing light. Her lips moved in silent words, and her hands gestured in patterns that seemed to pull the very shadows toward her. But it was her eyes that truly terrified him. They reflected the flickering light like those of a wild animal, and they seemed to be looking directly at him through the wall, as if she knew he was there, had always known he would come. Caldwell stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root and sending him sprawling into the dirt. The humming stopped instantly, and the light in the cabin went out. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. He lay there for what felt like hours, waiting for Eliza to emerge from her cabin, to confront him or raise an alarm. But nothing happened. The night remained still, and eventually Caldwell gathered enough courage to flee back to his house, his mind reeling with what he had witnessed. The next morning brought no relief. As Caldwell watched Eliza work in the fields, he found himself studying her face for any sign that she knew about his midnight spying. But her expression remained as impassive as ever, giving away nothing. Yet there was something different about her presence, something that made the air around her feel charged with an energy he couldn't name. "You look like hell," Webb observed as they made their morning rounds. "You feeling all right, sir?" Caldwell wanted to tell him about what he had seen, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain the impossible light, the otherworldly humming, the feeling that Eliza had been aware of his presence even through solid walls? Instead, he simply grunted and continued walking, his eyes never leaving the figure of the woman who was beginning to consume his every thought. That afternoon, as Caldwell sat in his office reviewing the plantation's records, he heard something that made his pen freeze mid-sentence. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling his house. But when he rushed to the window, he saw nothing but empty yard and the distant figures of slaves working in the fields. The footsteps continued for several minutes, always just outside his line of sight, always seeming to stay one step ahead of his attempts to locate their source. When they finally stopped, Caldwell found himself drenched in sweat despite the cool interior of his house. As evening approached, Caldwell made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of confronting Eliza directly, he would increase her workload even further, push her to the breaking point where whatever unnatural strength she possessed would finally fail her. He would prove to himself and everyone else that she was just a slave like any other, subject to the same limitations as the rest of her kind. But as he watched Eliza return to her cabin that night, moving with the same steady grace despite the day's brutal labor, Caldwell felt a chill run down his spine. The war between them was escalating, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't certain he would emerge victorious. In her cabin, Eliza carefully arranged her grandmother's gifts once more, whispering words of gratitude to ancestors who had endured far worse than Thomas Caldwell. The overseer's fear was growing, just as she had known it would. Fear was a seed that, once planted, would grow into something far more powerful than any whip or chain. The real torment was only beginning. The morning of August 15th, 1799, dawned with an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on Magnolia Grove like a suffocating blanket. Thomas Caldwell had barely slept for 3 consecutive nights, his rest plagued by dreams of footsteps that circled his house and eyes that watched him from impossible angles. The rational part of his mind insisted that stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on him, but the growing dread in his chest suggested otherwise. Eliza continued her work with the same unwavering consistency, but Caldwell had begun to notice things that defied explanation. When she walked through the tobacco fields, the plants seemed to lean away from her path, creating subtle corridors that weren't there moments before. Birds fell silent when she passed beneath their perches, and even the plantation's dogs, normally aggressive toward any slave who ventured too close to the main house, would whimper and retreat when she appeared. "Sir," Webb approached hesitantly during the midday break, "some of the other slaves been asking questions." Caldwell looked up from his ledger, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with dark circles. "What kind of questions?" "About Eliza, sir. They're scared of her. Say she's been talking to herself at night, but not in English, and they claim the temperature drops whenever she gets angry, even in this heat." "Superstitious nonsense," Caldwell snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. He had felt those same inexplicable cold spots himself, moments when the sweltering air would suddenly turn frigid around Eliza's presence. That afternoon, Caldwell decided to test his growing suspicions. He assigned Eliza to work alone in the farthest tobacco field, a section that bordered the dark pine forest where even the bravest slaves refused to venture after sunset. If she was practicing some form of witchcraft, isolation might force her to reveal her true nature. As Eliza made her way to the distant field, Caldwell followed at a distance, using the cover of tobacco plants to mask his approach. He positioned himself behind a large oak tree where he could observe her without being seen, determined to catch her in whatever unnatural act she was performing. For the first hour, Eliza worked normally, her movements efficient and purposeful as she tended to the tobacco plants. But as the sun reached its zenith, something extraordinary began to happen. The shadows around Eliza started to behave strangely, stretching and contracting independent of the sun's position. What should have been short midday shadows grew long and dark, reaching toward her like grasping fingers. Caldwell rubbed his eyes, certain that the heat was causing hallucinations. But when he looked again, the phenomenon had intensified. The shadows weren't just moving, they were responding to Eliza's presence, gathering around her feet like loyal pets. As she moved between the rows of tobacco, the shadows followed, creating a pool of darkness that seemed to cool the air around her. Then Eliza did something that made Caldwell's blood freeze. She stopped working and turned directly toward his hiding place, her dark eyes locking onto his position with impossible accuracy. A slow smile spread across her face, not cruel or mocking, but knowing. She had been aware of his presence all along. "You can come out now, mister." "Caldwell," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the field despite the distance between them. "No point in hiding when the shadows already told me you were there." Caldwell's legs felt like water, but pride and authority demanded that he respond. He emerged from behind the oak tree, trying to project the confidence that was rapidly draining from his body. "You're supposed to be working, not talking," he managed, his voice cracking slightly. Eliza resumed her task, but continued speaking as if they were having a casual conversation. "I am working, sir. Been working all my life. But work ain't just what you can see with your eyes." "What's that supposed to mean?" Caldwell demanded, moving closer despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. "Means some folks got gifts that go beyond picking tobacco and hauling water," Eliza replied, her hands never pausing in their work. "My grandmother, she had the sight. Could see things that were coming, things that were hidden. She passed some of that down to me before she died." Caldwell felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the strange coolness that surrounded Eliza. That's devil talk. Witchcraft." Eliza laughed, a sound that was neither bitter nor amused, but something far more unsettling. "Devil? Mr. Caldwell, you've been living with devils your whole life and calling them masters. What I got ain't evil. It's just older than your understanding." As if to demonstrate her point, Eliza gestured toward a nearby tobacco plant that had been struggling in the heat. Before Caldwell's eyes, the wilted leaves began to straighten and regain their color, as if receiving water from an invisible source. "How?" Caldwell whispered, his worldview crumbling with each impossible moment. "How don't matter," Eliza said, finally turning to face him fully. "What matters is that you've been trying to break something that can't be broken. You can cut my rations, work me till my hands bleed, beat me with that whip of yours. But you can't touch what lives in here." She tapped her chest over her heart. "And you can't stop what's already been set in motion." "What's been set in motion?" Caldwell asked, though he dreaded the answer. Eliza's smile widened, and for a moment, her eyes seemed to reflect light that wasn't there. "Your education, Mr. Caldwell. You've been teaching me about cruelty for weeks now. Time for me to teach you about fear." As if summoned by her words, a cloud passed over the sun, plunging the field into premature twilight. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Caldwell could see his breath, and the shadows around Eliza deepened until they seemed to have substance, weight, presence. Caldwell stumbled backward, his rational mind finally surrendering to the terror that had been building for weeks. He turned and ran, crashing through the tobacco plants in his desperation to escape, leaving behind his authority, his dignity, and his certainty about the natural order of the world. Behind him, Eliza's laughter followed, carried on a wind that touched nothing else in the field. The real haunting had begun, and Thomas Caldwell was about to discover that there were fates far worse than death, like living in a world where everything you believed about power and control was revealed to be an illusion. As the sun emerged from behind the cloud, restoring the field to its normal appearance, Eliza returned to her work. But now she hummed softly as she labored, an ancient melody that her grandmother had taught her, a song of patience and inevitable justice that had sustained her people through centuries of suffering. The shadows continued to dance around her feet, and in the distance, the sound of Caldwell's panicked flight grew fainter and fainter until it was swallowed entirely by the vast indifference of the Carolina wilderness. Thomas Caldwell burst through the door of his house like a man fleeing hellfire, his clothes torn from his desperate flight through the tobacco fields. Webb, who had been organizing the day's work assignments, looked up in alarm at his superior's wild appearance. "Sir, what happened? You look like you've seen a—" "Don't say it," Caldwell snapped, collapsing into his chair and reaching for the bottle of whiskey he kept in his desk drawer. His hands shook so violently that he could barely manage to pour the amber liquid into a glass. "Don't say anything about what I might have seen." Webb approached cautiously, noting the way Caldwell's eyes darted constantly toward the windows, as if expecting something to appear at any moment. "Sir, maybe you should rest. You've been pushing yourself awful hard lately." "Rest?" Caldwell laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "How can a man rest when the very foundations of reality are crumbling around him?" He drained the whiskey in one gulp, feeling the burn in his throat, but finding no comfort in its familiar sting. That evening, Caldwell made a decision that would prove to be another step toward his destruction. He would not allow Eliza to return to her cabin. Instead, he would lock her in the punishment shed, a windowless structure used to confine slaves who had committed serious infractions. If she truly possessed supernatural abilities, being trapped in a confined space would surely limit her power. "Webb, gather some of the field hands," Caldwell ordered, his voice gaining strength from the illusion of taking action. "We're moving Eliza to the punishment shed tonight. Sir, what's her offense? Master Whitmore usually requires documentation for—" "Her offense is existing," Caldwell snarled, "and I don't need Whitmore's permission to maintain discipline on this plantation." As darkness fell, Caldwell and 3 reluctant slaves approached Eliza's cabin. The overseer carried his pistol, though he wasn't entirely sure what good it would do against whatever Eliza had become in his mind. The slaves followed behind, their faces reflecting the same unease that had been growing throughout the plantation. They found Eliza sitting calmly outside her cabin, as if she'd been waiting for them. In the flickering light of their torches, her face appeared serene, almost amused by their arrival. "Evening, Mr. Caldwell," she said pleasantly. "Come to escort me somewhere?" "You're being moved to the punishment shed," Caldwell announced, trying to project authority he no longer felt. "For your own good and the safety of the other slaves." Eliza stood slowly, her movements deliberate and graceful. For my own good? That's mighty considerate of you, sir. And here I thought you were just scared. I'm not scared of you, Caldwell lied, his voice cracking on the words. No? Eliza tilted her head, studying him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Then why is your gun shaking in your hand? Why did you bring 3 men to move 1 unarmed woman? Why have you been drinking yourself to sleep every night since you started watching my cabin? The slaves exchanged nervous glances, realizing that their overseer's behavior had been observed and catalogued by the very person he was trying to control. Caldwell felt his face flush with embarrassment and rage. "Move!" he ordered, gesturing toward the punishment shed with his pistol. "Now!" Eliza complied without resistance, walking ahead of the group with the same steady pace she maintained in the fields. But as they approached the small, windowless building, strange things began to happen. The torches flickered and dimmed despite the absence of wind. The temperature dropped noticeably, and their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Most disturbing of all, their footsteps began to echo, not just the normal sound of feet on packed earth, but additional footsteps that seemed to come from all around them, as if an invisible crowd was accompanying their procession. "You hear that?" one of the slaves whispered to his companion. "Hear what?" the other replied, though his wide eyes suggested he heard it too. Caldwell forced himself to ignore the phantom sounds, focusing on the simple task of confining Eliza. He unlocked the heavy wooden door of the punishment shed and gestured for her to enter. "Your new accommodations," he said, trying to inject mockery into his voice. Eliza paused at the threshold, turning to look at him one final time. "Mr. Caldwell, you sure you want to lock me in here? Sometimes when you try to cage something, you just end up trapping yourself instead." "Get inside," Caldwell demanded, but his voice had lost all authority. Eliza shrugged and stepped into the dark interior of the shed. Caldwell slammed the door shut and turned the heavy iron key, the sound of the lock engaging echoing unnaturally in the night air. "There," he said to the assembled slaves, though he was really trying to convince himself. "Problem solved." But as they walked away from the punishment shed, the phantom footsteps continued, and Caldwell could swear he heard Eliza's voice drifting through the thick wooden walls, not calling for help or expressing distress, but humming that same ancient melody that had haunted his dreams. That night, Caldwell's torment reached new heights. The footsteps around his house became constant, circling endlessly with a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. When he looked out his windows, he saw nothing but darkness. Yet the sound continued, sometimes seeming to come from directly overhead, as if something was walking on his roof. Around midnight, he heard a new sound that made his blood run cold. The creak of the punishment shed door opening. Caldwell grabbed his pistol and a lantern, rushing outside to investigate. But when he reached the shed, the door was still locked, the key exactly where he had left it. Yet the creaking continued, the sound of hinges moving in the still night air. "Who's there?" Caldwell called out, his voice echoing across the empty yard. "Show yourself!" The only response was Eliza's laughter, drifting from inside the locked shed. Impossible and maddening. Caldwell pressed his ear to the door, hearing not just laughter but the sound of movement, as if Eliza was pacing freely within the confined space. "How?" he whispered, checking the lock again and again. "How is this possible?" As if in answer to his question, he heard Eliza's voice, clear and close, as if she was standing right beside him. "Some cages are stronger than others, Mr. Caldwell, but the strongest cage of all is the one you build in your own mind." Caldwell spun around, swinging his lantern in wild arcs, but found nothing but empty air. Yet Eliza's presence felt overwhelming, surrounding him like a suffocating blanket. He stumbled back to his house, slamming and barring the door behind him, but the feeling of being watched never left him. For the rest of the night, Caldwell sat in his chair with his pistol in his lap, listening to the impossible sounds coming from the punishment shed. Sometimes it was laughter, sometimes humming, and occasionally what sounded like conversations in a language he didn't recognize, as if Eliza was entertaining invisible guests. By dawn, Thomas Caldwell looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. His hair had begun to show streaks of grey, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much and understood too little. The war between overseer and slave had entered a new phase, one where the traditional rules of power and submission no longer applied. Eliza Moore was teaching Thomas Caldwell that there were forces in the world older and more powerful than whips and chains, and his education was far from over. Dawn brought no relief to Thomas Caldwell's tormented mind. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through his curtains, he realized that the sounds from the punishment shed had finally stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the impossible noises, filling him with a dread that made his stomach churn. Webb arrived for the morning briefing to find his superior slumped in his chair, still clutching his pistol, his clothes wrinkled and stained with sweat. The younger man had never seen Caldwell in such a state, and it frightened him more than he cared to admit. "Sir, should I check on the prisoner?" Webb asked hesitantly. Caldwell's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes focusing on Webb with difficulty. "The prisoner? Yes, check on her. But take 2 men with you, armed men." Webb nodded and left, returning 20 minutes later with a pale face and trembling hands. "Sir, she's gone." "Gone?" Caldwell shot to his feet, the pistol clattering to the floor. "What do you mean, gone? The door was locked." "Still is, sir. Lock's intact, keys where you left it, but the shed's empty. Not just empty. It's like she was never there at all." Caldwell pushed past Webb and ran to the punishment shed, his mind refusing to accept what he was hearing. He fumbled with the key, his hands shaking so badly that it took 3 attempts to unlock the door. When it finally swung open, he was confronted with an impossibility that shattered what remained of his rational worldview. The shed was indeed empty, but more than that, it was pristine. The dirt floor showed no signs of occupation, no footprints, no disturbance of any kind. The air inside was cool and fresh, not the stifling, stale atmosphere that should have accumulated overnight. It was as if Eliza had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of her presence. "This is impossible," Caldwell whispered, stepping into the shed and examining every inch of the walls and floor. "People don't just disappear. They don't..." His voice trailed off as he noticed something that made his knees weak. Carved into the wooden wall, in letters that seemed to glow with their own inner light, was a message. "The cage is in your mind, Thomas Caldwell, and I hold the key." "Sir?" Webb called from outside, afraid to enter the shed himself. "What do you want me to tell the field hands?" Caldwell staggered out of the shed, his face ashen. Tell them she's been moved. Tell them anything, just get them back to work." But as the morning progressed, it became clear that Eliza's disappearance had not gone unnoticed by the other slaves. They whispered among themselves, their voices carrying a mixture of fear and something that might have been hope. Some claimed to have seen her walking through the fields at dawn, her figure shimmering like a mirage. Others insisted they had heard her humming from the direction of the old cemetery where the plantation slaves were buried. Caldwell tried to maintain his routine, but every shadow seemed to hide Eliza's form. Every sound might be her footsteps. When he walked through the tobacco fields, he felt eyes watching him from every direction, yet when he turned to look, he saw only the bent backs of working slaves who refused to meet his gaze. Around midday, as Caldwell stood on the porch of his house, trying to regain some semblance of control, he heard a voice that made his blood freeze. "You look tired, Mr. Caldwell." He spun around to find Eliza standing at the bottom of the porch steps, exactly as she had always been, solid, real, and impossible. She wore the same rough slave clothing, her expression calm and patient, as if she had simply been away for a brief walk. You were locked in the shed," Caldwell stammered, his hand instinctively reaching for his pistol. "Was I?" Eliza asked, tilting her head with genuine curiosity. "Funny thing about locks, Mr. Caldwell. They only work if you believe in them. This isn't real, Caldwell said, more to himself than to her. You're not real. I'm having a breakdown, that's all. Too much stress, too much whiskey. Eliza began walking up the porch steps, her heavy footsteps making the wooden boards creak under her weight. Real is a funny word, don't you think? Is the fear you're feeling real? Is the sweat on your forehead real? Is the way your heart's racing right now real? With each question, she climbed another step, and Caldwell found himself backing toward his front door. Stay away from me. I'm warning you. Warning me? Eliza laughed, that same unsettling sound that had haunted his dreams. With what? That little gun you keep dropping. The authority you think you have over me? Mr. Caldwell, you still don't understand what's happening here. Caldwell's back hit his front door, and he fumbled for the handle without taking his eyes off Eliza. What do you want from me? Eliza stopped just a few feet away, close enough that he could see his own terrified reflection in her dark eyes. I want you to understand something, Thomas Caldwell. For 32 years, I've been told I'm nothing, property, less than human. I've been beaten, starved, worked until my hands bled, and told that this is the natural order of things. Her voice remained calm, conversational, but there was something underneath it that made Caldwell's skin crawl. But you know what I learned from my grandmother before she died. I learned that power isn't about who holds the whip, it's about who controls the fear. As she spoke, the temperature around them began to drop, and Caldwell could see his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The shadows on the porch deepened and began to move independently of their sources, reaching toward him like grasping fingers. For weeks now, you've been trying to break me, Eliza continued, cutting my food, working me harder, trying to prove that you have power over me, but all you've really done is show me how afraid you are. Afraid that maybe, just maybe, I'm not what you think I am. Caldwell managed to get his door open and stumbled inside, but Eliza followed, her presence filling his house like a suffocating fog. You can't come in here. This is my house. Your house? Eliza looked around the modest interior with apparent interest. Built with slave labor, furnished with slave profits, maintained by slave work. Seems to me like I have more right to be here than you do. Caldwell grabbed his pistol from where he had dropped it earlier, pointing it at Eliza with shaking hands. I'll shoot you. I swear I will. Eliza regarded the weapon with mild curiosity. Go ahead, Mr. Caldwell. Pull that trigger. See what happens when you try to kill something that's already dead inside. The words hit Caldwell like a physical blow. What? What do you mean? I mean that 32 years of slavery kills something in a person, Eliza said, her voice growing softer, more dangerous. Kills the part that feels pain, that fears death, that cares about the opinions of small, cruel men. What you're looking at now isn't really Eliza Moore anymore. It's what's left when everything human has been stripped away. As she spoke, her form seemed to waver, becoming less solid, more shadow than substance. And what's left, Mr. Caldwell, is very, very angry. The pistol fell from Caldwell's nerveless fingers as he realized that he was no longer dealing with a human being, but with something far more terrifying, the accumulated rage and pain of generations of suffering, given form and purpose, and an unquenchable thirst for justice. Please, he whispered, all pretense of authority finally abandoned. Please, I was just doing my job. Eliza's laugh filled the house, echoing from every corner, every shadow. Your job? Your job was to break human beings for profit. Your job was to convince yourself that cruelty was justified. Your job was to sleep peacefully while people suffered for your comfort. The shadows in the room began to move more aggressively, reaching for Caldwell from all directions. Well, Mr. Caldwell, now you have a new job. You're going to learn what it feels like to be afraid every moment of every day. You're going to understand what it means to have no control, no power, no hope. Caldwell fell to his knees, his mind finally snapping under the weight of terror and impossibility. I'm sorry for everything. Sorry? Eliza's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Sorry is what you say when you accidentally step on someone's foot. What you did to me, to all of us, requires something more than sorry. As the shadows closed in around him, Thomas Caldwell realized that his torment was far from over. Eliza Moore had become something beyond human vengeance, something that would haunt him until he understood the true weight of the chains he had helped to forge. The overseer's education in fear was entering its final phase, and there would be no graduation from this particular school of suffering. Thomas Caldwell's descent into madness accelerated with each passing day. Word of his erratic behavior spread throughout Magnolia Grove like wildfire. Whispered conversations among slaves and worried discussions between Webb and the other white overseers from neighboring plantations. The man who had once ruled with an iron fist now jumped at shadows and spoke to empty air. Eliza's presence had become a constant in Caldwell's life, though she appeared to no one else. She would materialize in his peripheral vision, always just out of direct sight, her heavy footsteps echoing through his house at all hours. Sometimes he would find her sitting in his chair when he entered a room, only to have her vanish the moment he blinked. Other times he would hear her humming that ancient melody from inside locked rooms, the sound seeming to come from within the very walls themselves. "Sir, Master Whitmore is asking questions," Webb reported during what had become their increasingly brief morning meetings. "He's heard talk about irregularities in your behavior." Caldwell looked up from his desk, where he had been staring at the same page of records for over an hour without reading a single word. His appearance had deteriorated dramatically. His clothes hung loose on his shrinking frame. His hair had gone completely grey, and his eyes held the wild look of a man perpetually on the edge of panic. "Irregularities?" Caldwell laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Is that what they're calling it? Tell me, Webb, do you see her too?" "See who, sir?" "Eliza. She's standing right behind you, you know. Been there for the past 10 minutes just watching us talk." Webb turned around quickly, seeing nothing but empty space. When he looked back at Caldwell, his concern had deepened into genuine fear. "Sir, there's nobody there. Maybe you should see a doctor. Get some rest." "Rest?" Caldwell stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "How can I rest when she never leaves? She's in my house, in my dreams, in my very thoughts. She's everywhere and nowhere, and she's driving me insane." The outburst attracted the attention of several slaves working near the overseer's house. They exchanged meaningful glances, their expressions mixing fear with something that might have been satisfaction. The man who had terrorized them for years was finally experiencing terror himself. That afternoon, Master Jonathan Whitmore arrived at the plantation for an unannounced inspection. A tall, distinguished man in his 50s, Whitmore had built his wealth on the backs of enslaved people, but he prided himself on running an efficient operation. Caldwell's recent behavior threatened that efficiency. "Thomas," Whitmore said as he entered the overseer's house, "we need to talk." Caldwell was standing by his window, staring out at the tobacco fields with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "She's out there," he muttered without turning around. "Always out there, watching, waiting. Who's out there, Thomas?" "Eliza Moore, the fat slave, the one who—" Caldwell's voice trailed off as he realized how insane he sounded. Whitmore frowned. "Eliza Moore? I don't recall any slave by that name on my roster." The words hit Caldwell like a physical blow. He spun around, his face pale with shock. "What do you mean you don't recall her? She's been here for years. Large woman, works in the tobacco fields, lives in the quarters." "Thomas, I know every slave on this plantation. There is no Eliza Moore." Whitmore's voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. "Perhaps you should describe this woman to me." Caldwell's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. How could he describe someone who might not exist? How could he explain the impossible things he had witnessed? She's real. I've spoken to her, assigned her work, locked her in the punishment shed." "The punishment shed has been empty for months," Whitmore replied. his concern growing. "Thomas, I think you need medical attention. This obsession with a non-existent slave is affecting your ability to manage this plantation." As if summoned by their conversation, Eliza's voice drifted through the house, clear and unmistakable. "Tell him about the shadows, Mr. Caldwell. Tell him about the footsteps that follow you everywhere." Caldwell's eyes went wide with terror. "You heard that. You had to have heard that." Whitmore looked around the room, seeing and hearing nothing unusual. "Thomas, there's no one here but us. I think it's time you took a leave of absence." "No!" Caldwell grabbed Whitmore's arm desperately. "She's real. Ask the other slaves, they'll tell you about her." To humor his increasingly unstable overseer, Whitmore agreed to question some of the field hands. But when they gathered a group of slaves and asked about Eliza Moore, the responses only deepened the mystery. Eliza, old Samuel, the eldest slave on the plantation, scratched his graying head. "Can't say I know any Eliza, Master Whitmore." "Big woman, works in tobacco," Caldwell pressed, his voice rising with desperation. The slaves exchanged glances, their faces carefully neutral. "No, sir," Samuel replied. "Ain't no woman by that name working these fields." But Caldwell noticed something in their eyes, a flicker of recognition quickly suppressed. They knew something, even if they wouldn't admit it. The conspiracy of silence only added to his growing paranoia. That night, alone in his house after Whitmore's departure, Caldwell finally confronted the possibility that had been growing in his mind like a cancer. What if Eliza Moore had never existed? What if she was a manifestation of his own guilt, a psychological punishment for years of cruelty? "You're starting to understand," Eliza's voice whispered from the darkness of his bedroom. Caldwell sat up in bed, his heart pounding. She was there, sitting in the chair by his window, her large form silhouetted against the moonlight. "Understand what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That guilt has weight, Mr. Caldwell. 32 years of accumulated guilt, pressed down and ignored until it takes on a life of its own." Eliza's voice was different now, layered with the voices of countless others. "I am every slave you've beaten, every person you've broken, every life you've destroyed in service to your masters." Caldwell felt tears streaming down his face. "I was just following orders. I was just doing my job. And now your job is to carry the weight of what you've done," Eliza replied, standing and moving closer to his bed. "To feel the fear you've inflicted, to know the helplessness you've created, to understand that some sins are too heavy for one man to bear alone." As she approached, Caldwell could see that she was no longer alone. Behind her, filling his bedroom, were the shadowy forms of dozens of people, men, women, and children, all bearing the marks of slavery's cruelty. Their eyes reflected the same patient suffering he had seen in Eliza's gaze, and their presence filled the room with a weight that pressed down on his chest like a physical force. "We are all here, Thomas Caldwell," the collective voices whispered. "Every person you helped to break, every spirit you tried to crush. We have been waiting for you to see us, to acknowledge what you've done." Caldwell fell from his bed, crawling backward until his back hit the wall. I'm sorry, please just leave me alone." "Sorry is not enough," Eliza said, her form becoming more solid while the others remained as shadows. "But it's a beginning. The question now is, what are you willing to do to earn forgiveness?" As the ghostly assembly faded with the approaching dawn, Caldwell was left alone with a terrible understanding. His torment was not random cruelty, but a form of justice that transcended the physical world. Eliza Moore, whether real or imagined, had become the instrument of his reckoning, and there would be no escape until he found a way to balance the scales of his accumulated sins. The harvest of fear was nearly complete, but the final lesson in Thomas Caldwell's education was yet to come. The autumn of 1799 brought an early chill to South Carolina, and with it the final chapter in Thomas Caldwell's transformation. 3 months had passed since Master Whitmore's visit, and the overseer's condition had deteriorated beyond all recognition. He had lost nearly 40 pounds. His hair had turned completely white, and he spoke in whispers when he spoke at all. Webb had effectively taken over the day-to-day operations of Magnolia Grove, though he did so with growing unease. The slaves had begun to behave differently, working with a quiet efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. They no longer required constant supervision, and their productivity had actually increased, despite, or perhaps because of, Caldwell's absence from the fields. "It's like they're working for someone else," Webb confided to his wife during one of his rare visits home. "Someone we can't see." Caldwell spent his days sitting on his porch, staring out at the tobacco fields with an intensity that unnerved anyone who saw him. He had stopped eating regularly, surviving on whatever Webb brought him, and he rarely slept for more than an hour at a time. But strangest of all, he had begun to change in ways that went beyond physical deterioration. The cruelty that had defined his character for decades was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like compassion. When slaves passed by his house, he would nod respectfully, sometimes even apologizing under his breath for transgressions they couldn't remember. He had given away most of his possessions to the slave quarters, claiming he no longer needed material things. "He's lost his mind completely," Webb reported to Master Whitmore during their weekly meetings. "Yesterday I found him teaching one of the slave children to read. When I told him it was illegal, he just looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language." Whitmore frowned, considering his options. Perhaps it's time to replace him permanently. A man in his condition is a liability. But before any decision could be made, Thomas Caldwell made one final choice that would define his legacy. On a cold November morning, as frost covered the tobacco fields like a shroud, Caldwell walked to the old slave cemetery at the edge of the plantation. It was a place he had never visited before, a collection of unmarked graves where the plantation's enslaved workers had been buried over the decades. The ground was uneven, marked by simple wooden crosses and stones that bore no names, no dates, no acknowledgement of the lives they represented. Eliza was waiting for him there, sitting on a fallen log near the center of the cemetery. But she was different now, less solid, more translucent, as if she was fading away. "You came," she said, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "I had to," Caldwell replied, his own voice barely audible. "I finally understand what you've been trying to teach me." "And what's that, Mr. Caldwell?" Caldwell knelt among the unmarked graves, his hands touching the cold earth. "That every person buried here had a name, a story, a life that mattered. That I helped to erase those lives, to reduce human beings to property and profit." Eliza nodded slowly. "And what do you intend to do with that understanding?" "I don't know," Caldwell admitted, tears freezing on his cheeks in the cold air. "How do you make amends for 32 years of cruelty? How do you balance scales that heavy?" "You can't," Eliza said simply. "Some debts are too large for one lifetime to repay, but you can start." Caldwell looked up at her, seeing not the terrifying specter that had haunted him for months, but a woman who had endured unimaginable suffering with dignity and strength. "Tell me how. The slaves on this plantation, they need more than just freedom from your cruelty. They need education, opportunity, hope for their children. You have knowledge, connections, resources. Use them." Over the following weeks, Thomas Caldwell began a transformation that shocked everyone who knew him. He started secretly teaching slaves to read and write, using his own house as a hidden school. He began documenting the names and stories of every enslaved person on the plantation, creating a record that would preserve their humanity for future generations. Most dramatically, he began using his position to help slaves escape to freedom. His knowledge of the plantation's routines, the patrol schedules, and the local geography made him an invaluable ally to the Underground Railroad. One by one, families began disappearing from Magnolia Grove, vanishing into the night with Caldwell's assistance. Master Whitmore noticed the declining slave population, but attributed it to runaways and natural attrition. By the time he realized what was happening, nearly half of his human property had vanished, and Thomas Caldwell had disappeared as well. The overseer was found 3 days later in the slave cemetery, sitting peacefully among the graves with a journal in his lap. He had died sometime during the night, apparently of natural causes, though he was only 45 years old. The journal contained detailed records of every slave who had lived and died on Magnolia Grove, along with a confession of his crimes and a plea for forgiveness. But most remarkably, the journal also contained maps and detailed instructions for escape routes, safe houses, and contacts in the Underground Railroad, information that would help dozens more people reach freedom in the years to come. Eliza Moore was never seen again after Caldwell's death, though some of the remaining slaves claimed to hear her humming on quiet nights, a sound that brought comfort rather than fear. Whether she had been real or imagined, her purpose had been fulfilled. The overseer who had once embodied the cruelest aspects of slavery had been transformed into an instrument of liberation. Webb found himself promoted to head overseer, but he discovered that managing the remaining slaves was nearly impossible. They worked with a quiet determination that seemed to mock his authority, and they possessed a knowledge of reading and writing that made them dangerous in ways the plantation system couldn't tolerate. Within a year, Magnolia Grove was sold, its remaining enslaved population scattered to other plantations. But the seeds that Thomas Caldwell had planted in his final months continued to grow. Former slaves who had learned to read became teachers themselves, passing on literacy and hope to others. The escape routes he had documented remained active for decades, helping countless people find their way to freedom. The story of Eliza Moore became legend among the enslaved communities of South Carolina. Some said she had been a real woman whose spirit refused to be broken. Others claimed she was the collective soul of all who had suffered under slavery's yoke, given form and purpose by the weight of accumulated injustice. But all agreed on one thing. She had proven that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit could find a way to claim victory over its oppressors. Years later, when the Civil War finally brought an end to slavery in America, former slaves would gather to tell the story of the obese woman who had driven her overseer to madness, and in doing so had driven him to redemption. They spoke of how fear, when turned back upon its source, could become a tool of justice more powerful than any whip or chain. Thomas Caldwell's grave, marked with a simple stone bearing only his name and dates, stood in the white section of the local cemetery. But on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the air was still, people claimed to see a large figure standing beside it, not in triumph or mockery, but in a kind of patient vigil, as if watching over the soul of a man who had found his way from darkness into light. The plantation house of Magnolia Grove eventually fell into ruin, its white columns cracking and its grand rooms filling with dust and memories. But the slave cemetery remained, and in 1965, a group of civil rights activists placed a marker there that read, "In memory of all who suffered here, and in honor of those who found the courage to resist." Some visitors to the cemetery reported feeling a presence among the graves, not frightening, but protective, as if the spirits of the enslaved were still watching over their descendants. And on very quiet nights, when the wind was just right, they claimed to hear the faint sound of humming, an ancient melody that spoke of endurance, resistance, and the unbreakable power of the human spirit. The story of Eliza Moore reminds us that justice, though it may be delayed, is never truly denied. In a world where power seemed absolute and resistance appeared futile, one woman, whether real or imagined, proved that the oppressed always possess weapons their oppressors cannot see. The power of fear turned back upon itself, the weight of accumulated guilt, and the terrible, beautiful strength of a spirit that refuses to be broken. Thomas Caldwell learned in the end that true power lies not in the ability to inflict suffering, but in the courage to acknowledge it, to feel its weight, and to spend whatever time remains in service of healing the wounds we have helped to create. His transformation from tormentor to liberator stands as proof that redemption is possible, even for those who have traveled furthest into darkness. And somewhere in the mists of history and legend, Eliza Moore continues her eternal watch, a guardian spirit for all who suffer under the weight of injustice, a reminder that no system of oppression, no matter how entrenched, can ultimately defeat the human capacity for resistance, transformation, and hope. The overseer's madness had become his salvation, and the slave's revenge had become her gift to future generations. A story of how the powerless can claim power, how the voiceless can find their voice, and how even the deepest darkness can be transformed into light. In the end, Eliza Moore had taught Thomas Caldwell the most important lesson of all, that we are all connected by invisible chains of consequence and responsibility, and that true freedom comes only when we acknowledge the weight of those chains and work to break them for everyone. The story ends, but the lesson endures, echoing through the generations like an ancient song of justice, patience, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit.